Butcher! The wild roar shook the bundles of dried mushrooms and fish under the cabin's ceiling, and the flames in the hearth rippled. The huge wolfhound, dozing by the door, opened one eye and turned his head slightly to check that his master was not being cut to pieces and eaten alive. After ensuring nothing terrible was happening, the dog took a deep breath and went back to sleep, twitching his wet nose. "You've got a piece of iron the size of Thor's man's pride sticking out of your thigh," said Guthorm Björnsson, known to many as the Walrus, to his friend lying on the bench in front of him. "If we don't get it out and sew up the wound, you'll eat immortal boar meat at Odin's stable in a week. Are you in a hurry?" Thorkel Magnusson, known as Thorkel the Yellow-Eyed, let out a long, intricate swearing in which he mentioned Guthorm, his ancestors, all kinds of rusty iron, and finally Odin and his never-dying piglet. Then sighed just like a wolfhound and said, "Well, if you're started to mess with my ass, let's get it done. I can't stand it anymore." "I'm not up to enjoying your howling," Guthorm answered, "so we'll make short work of it. Here, bite this, so as not to scare away all the bears in the forest." He then handed his friend a polished wooden block. "What's that, for hell's sake?" Thorkel glanced at it. "What hole have you shoved it into so often that it shines like 3 bifrosts?" "I've had enough of you," Guthorm shouted angrily. "If you don't like it, don't. It's your choice." He turned to the hearth and began to heat a sharp knife on the fire. "It's a stopper from the cellar door, you fool," he said in a lower tone. "Do me a favor, will you, or I'll go deaf." The pine wood in the hearth was more than half burned out. It no longer cracked incessantly like bored magpies, but only occasionally snapped, and there was no light from it, just a reddish glow. Thorkel reached for the mug, but in the darkness he missed and pushed it off the table. Thorkel grunted and stood up, but Guthorm waved his hand and said, "Lay down." Thorkel was half lying on the wide bench by the table, but he could not sit upright even if he wanted to. Guthorm took a long splinter from the wood pile by the door, lit it from the coals in the hearth, and brought it to the oil bowl on the table. The long yellow tongue stretched its trembling foxtail toward the rafters, and charcoal black blotches of shadow scattered in the corners of the cabin. "It's nice here," said Thorkel, watching the puddle of ale spilled out of his mug slowly seep into the cracks between the floorboards. "And you've got a good idea with that oil too. It burns longer than a torch and gives more light." "I learned it from the Frisians," said Guthorm, stooping down and picking up a mug from the floor. "Their konung had some special bronze things in the great hall. If they were filled in time, they burned all night. I wanted to get one, but couldn't get a good bargain." "I'm fine with the bowl," said Thorkel. The beer had softened his pained features, and even his grayish-black beard had ceased to stick forward belligerently, but instead fell on Yellow-Eyed's broad chest. The flickering red coals and oil fire gave Thorkel's famous amber eyes a distinct reddish hue, and they glittered in the darkness like Garm's evil squint. "It feels so peaceful. Now I understand why you'd come all the way out here." "I won't argue," said Guthorm, scooping ale from the small barrel with the mug. "I like it myself, or I wouldn't live here." Wiping the wet mug with a bundle of straw, he set it on the table in front of Thorkel and warned him. "The last one for today. You're tired, and you shouldn't drink too much. And you could use a good rest." He grinned. "I'm ashamed to say that. It's a good ale." "Awesome ale." Thorkel nodded and took a long sip. "And you were scolding me for coming to you. I don't judge you for bringing me ale, but for going alone. I knew the Sigurdsson brothers were out here somewhere. Couldn't you have asked old Hrolf for company? What if Svein hadn't missed and stuck that dart an elbow above your ass?" Thorkel shrugged. "Well, he always was a knuckle-dragger. Harold threw him out of the herd for a reason. And his brother is a log, just as big and just as dumb. Well, now they're done for good. Got the wrong man to rob, idiots." And he took another sip. Guthorm was silent, twirling his long mustache, for which he was nicknamed. "All right," he said. "Now that you're alive and cheerful, to say the least, why don't you tell me what happened in Midgard that you came to me alone on a road where two of the most notorious outlaws in all of Hladir are known to dwell? Don't tell me about the ale, because if it had been just that, you wouldn't have gone anywhere at all. You'd stayed at Hrolf's, drinking, eating, and chasing maidens." Thorkel snorted. "You're insulting me," he said. "One only drinks such good ale with his best friend. And anyway, Hrolf isn't the same anymore. He would be under the table after the second mug." He grew serious. "But you're right, it's not the ale. Or rather, it's not about ale alone. You're sitting here in your forest, and you don't know a thing. But in Hladir, a big mess seems to be brewing." Guthorm looked at his friend over the mug. "Hakon again." Thorkel nodded. "Yes, everyone thought he'd calm down after the defeat of the Jomsvikings, but no such luck. It seemed he was serious about taking over the whole of Hladir." Guthorm twitched his left mustache thoughtfully. "It was to be expected. Men like Hakon always want more. More glory, more power, more silver. I thought it would take him a little longer to start a new circle, at least 7 or 8 years, and he did it in 4. But tell me, what's that got to do with me? What's the rush?" "Don't play dumb," Thorkel grinned. "Given your history with Hakon, you had much to do with it." "I paid the Wergild," Guthorm said gravely, "in full. And Hakon has sworn not to declare me a blood enemy if I do not cross the borders of his domain." "Exactly," Thorkel nodded. "And Hakon has always kept his word, no matter how much he hates it. But it won't be long before all of Hladir becomes Hakon's domain. And you live in Hladir." There was a long silence, interrupted only by snuffling of the wolfhound sleeping at the door. "Hell and her spawn," said Guthorm at last. "4 years ago, Guthorm and Thorkel had fought with the Jomsvikings fleet against Jarl Hakon at the Battle of Hjörungavang. When the Jomsvikings Jarl Sigvaldi and his brother Thorkel, the yellow-eyed namesake, were frightened by a sudden storm of supposedly sorcerous nature and took their ships away, Guthorm and Thorkel were among the few surviving Jomsvikings captured by Hakon. Hakon, who was in high spirits after the sudden victory, spared Vagn Åkesson, the only survivor of the remaining Jomsvikings, along with all his companions, by making them swear never to raise a sword against the Jarls of Hladir. He also wanted to make them swear never to be baptized. But Vagn, hearing this, laughed loudly and said that even if the Jomsvikings had agreed to stand together with the Konung of Christian Denmark, it did not mean that any of them would ever submit to the sorcery of the shaven-headed southerners in black robes. Hakon was embarrassed, and to avoid looking ridiculous, turned the conversation to another topic. Most of the Vikings, together with Vagn, had left Hakon's court, but one of the Jarl's retainers, Björn Svensson, had persuaded Guthorm and Thorkel, at the instigation of Hakon himself, of course, who was always keen to get good fighters under his hand, to stay as the Jarl's men. Friends hesitated not long, as they did not want to return to Jarl Sigvaldi, who had abandoned them in the midst of the battle. But fate turned so that they did not serve Hakon for long. One day, after a feast, the Jarl's third cousin, Eyvind Claw, who was quite tipsy, began to insult Guthorm, saying that he had shamefully surrendered instead of dying with a weapon in his hands, as befitted a Jomsviking. Guthorm tried to calm him down, but Eyvind was so furious and grabbed his axe, and then Guthorm, who had come to the feast unarmed, grabbed the spit on which the boar had been roasting earlier and stabbed Eyvind. The Jarl was furious and wanted to execute both of them right away, as Thorkel immediately sided with his friend. But witnesses to the quarrel confirmed that Eyvind was the instigator, and the Jarl had to give in. It was agreed that Guthorm would pay the Vergild for the murder, and swear never to appear in Hakon's domain again. Of course, the friends did not have full silver for the Vergild, but Guthorm gave a sword decorated with precious stones that had once been given to him by the Wendish Konung, and Thorkel added a silver-finished chainmail, the work of skilled Frankish craftsmen, and the Jarl reluctantly agreed. Guthorm found a place in the woods near the borders of old Hrolf Svensson's land, a bond who neither obeyed Hakon nor paid tribute to him, built himself a small log cabin and settled there, hunting few animals and fishing in the local rivulet. Thorkel, who had not sworn any oath to the Jarl, went wandering around Hladir, even visited Skane a couple of times. Simply speaking, he continued the free life of a wanderer, not obliged to anyone and not particularly attached to anything. But, as they say, no matter how much you hide from fate, it will find you. So it looks like you're going to have to move on, my friend, Thorkel said, setting the empty mug down on the table. I wouldn't stick around if I were in your place. You're not in my place as it is, Guthorm said, so don't linger. Thorkel's eyes flashed and his beard upped belligerently again. It seems like some walrus snout wants to insult me, he said, and I'm going to yank out that walrus's hanging pride, even though I got an extra hole in my ass now. Guthorm laughed and waved his hand. You really have had enough to drink. Whom do you take me for? It's just that Hakon won't be here tomorrow morning anyway, and you need to heal your soft flesh in warmth and comfort, not in a lonely hunter's hut where there is not enough space even for two of us to sit together at the table. And there is no need to snivel so resentfully. You know I'm right. Thorkel sighed. Yes, right as usual. I'd say offensively right. What are you talking about? Offended. You're such a touchy boy. The wolfhound at the door twitched and perked his ears, and Guthorm realized that he had suddenly raised his voice. Well, I'm sorry. Perhaps I should have said that to you in a different way. You know, I am not much for grand speeches. That's true, Thorkel grinned. Eyvind can attest that you couldn't talk him down. It wasn't a very funny joke, but it did help to lighten the mood. All right, Guthorm said after a moment's silence. Let's go to bed. Tomorrow you'll take my horse and Hrym, he nodded at the wolfhound, and go to Hrolf. They will find their own way back. Lie there for now and brag about how you killed Sweyn and, what was his name? Gunnar, and I'll decide what to do. Thorkel chuckled. Did you really call the dog Hrym? Guthorm shrugged. Why not? He's huge as Jotunn, and he finds his way anywhere. A true steersman, not like some dumbass who got lost in 3 fir trees and bump into bandits. It seems like... Thorkel started again, but couldn't help but join his friend's joyous laughter. Fate, as always, was the most cunning of all. The Norns, tired of unraveling the tangle of fates, grabbed one end and pulled at it as hard as they could to distract themselves for a moment from the intricacies of human intentions and actions. 3 days had passed since the morning when Thorkel, grunting, climbed on a horse and rode off to the old Hrolf's homestead. Both the horse and the vigilant Hrym returned safely not earlier than the next evening, for Hrolf's manservants had given them good rest and a good meal before letting them go back to Guthorm's place. All 3 days Guthorm was going about his life as usual. He went around the snares, skinned the prey, repaired the hunting gear, and prepared simple food. But he did it all almost without noticing. His head was literally swollen with contradictions that tore it apart. At some point, he almost decided that he was ready to send the stubborn Jarl Hakon to hell and move somewhere in the middle of nowhere, where not only Hakon, but even Loki himself would not find him, to Iceland or in the dense forest of Smaland. But a small and harmful worm, the same one that had once prevented him from returning to Jomsborg to Sigvaldi, who had betrayed them, did not let him rest even now. Guthorm envied Thorkel, and nowhere felt better than on a ship's bench with an oar in his hands, or in the narrow streets of a burning Frankish town, or at the feast of yet another sea conung with whom he went to collect Danegeld. He had nothing to lose, no family, no yard, only an axe, a chainmail, and a cunning look of amber eyes. But Guthorm had long ago begun to think of settling down somewhere, at least for a while, if not forever, to catch his breath, to look around and think what to do with his hectic life. During the 4 years that he had lived on the outskirts of Old Hrolf's land, he had changed. He had made and discarded many plans for the future, and though he had not decided what he would do next, one thing was certain. He had become so fond of this cabin, and the bend of the small river, and the rare visits of Thorkel or any of Hrolf's numerous relatives and servants, that he was not going to give it all up for a good life to anyone, neither to the restless Hakon, nor even to the one-eyed himself, if he ever wanted to settle down in the remote forest of Hladir. And just as Guthorm was about to finish this simple thought, a heavy snowball struck the door of the cabin, and a familiar husky voice, which he did not want to remember, shouted, "Hey, Jomsviking! Crawl out from your hole! We need to talk!" Hrym jumped up. The low growl started from the deep of his throat, but Guthorm calmly put his hand on the back of the dog's neck and said, "Quiet, Hrym, quiet. I'll take care of it." The dog quieted down, but remained standing, looking warily at his master as if asking, "What kind of games are you playing with these suspicious guests?" Guthorm patted the dog once more, threw a wolf's pelt on his shoulders, since the night had caught the freshly fallen snow with a light frost, and went out of the cabin, squinting against the winter sun. An old acquaintance stood 20 paces away from the hut, leaning his shoulder carelessly on the trunk of a young pine tree that seemed flimsy compared to his stocky figure. Olaf Hemmingsson, known as a Boar's Tusk, was the right hand and chief advisor of Jarl Hakon. He was flanked by more Vikings along the edge of the forest, the best fighters of the Jarl's retinue. Guthorm knew some of them by sight, some by name, but the atmosphere was not conducive to lengthy greetings. Like Olaf, all the Vikings wore armor and helmets, and stood with one hand resting on shields thrown from their backs and the other stroking the hilt of a sword or axe. At Olaf's feet lay a tied-up leather sack. It was Olaf who had been at odds with two Jomsvikings from the start. He had been the one who had most urged Hakon to execute them both without further delay 4 years ago. The fact that it was he who came to speak for the Jarl did not bode well. "Well, be safe and sound, Olaf," said Guthorm. "I'm not sure I'll hear the same from you." "That's up to you, Jomsviking," Olaf replied. His fingers played with the huge tusk of the boar on his chest. "Up to what you gonna say and do." Guthorm too leaned back against the cabin's log wall and crossed his arms over his chest. "Is Jarl Hakon tired of keeping his word?" Olaf grinned. "Not at all. He sent us to confirm that he still agrees not to touch you, as long as you don't cross the borders of his domain. Since I live in the same place I did 4 years ago, I wonder if it was worth to send such a lavish embassy just to tell me that nothing has changed." Guthorm looked around at the Vikings. There were 17 of them, along with Olaf, and not a single archer. Boar's Tusk had always disliked archers. The boar he had slain when he was 13 had been enraged by a misplaced arrow and had killed his father and 2 older brothers before meeting Olaf. "Well, why hasn't it changed?" Olaf smiled. "It has. Jarl Hakon now owns all of Hladir. That is why he is asking you to leave his domain. He wanted you to leave at once, but I'll let you pack, if there is anything to pack for a beggar like a Jomsviking outcast, of course." Guthorm was not surprised in the least. It was exactly what he'd been expecting. "In advance of your question, I'll tell you immediately," Olaf continued. "Your decrepit patron has been sensible and agreed to become a tribute to Jarl Hakon." "He is not my patron. Hrolf is my old friend." "Really?" Olaf asked indifferently. "Well, then you'll be probably glad to hear that he betrayed you without hesitation. We didn't even have to rape his eldest daughter." Strangely enough, Guthorm was actually glad that Hrolf and his family were unharmed. Guthorm knew Olaf well. Paying tribute to a distant and greedy jarl is no good deal, but watching your estate burn to ashes is far more unpleasant. As for Guthorm's role in the affair, sooner or later Hakon would have gotten to the estate of the last independent bond anyway. "You have a simple choice," Olaf continued. "Either you say yes to me now, get in your den to collect your stuff, and get out of here in one piece, or you will soon be telling the Valkyries about your heroic death in defense of a rotten shack. Come on, Jomsviking, decide quickly, 'cause I don't want to freeze my ass for too long." Guthorm was silent. 17 Vikings. 17 seasoned fighters who had been through dozens, if not hundreds, of battles and skirmishes. No archers, yes, but 17. If only they were Frankish militia or Irish rabble in skins. I must think, Guthorm said. Back in my place. Olaf grinned again. Of course, Jomsviking. One should think hard before making wise decisions. So go and think. But here's the thing. I've already told you that it's cold here, and if you're stuck there for a long time, I'll just prop up your door with a log and burn you like a rat in an old barn. Between you and me, Olaf added in a trusting, almost friendly tone, I'd rather you did that. It's less trouble for us, and we'll keep warm at the same time, won't we? The Vikings laughed approvingly, and someone shouted, Just roll us a nail if you have any. It's no good for ale to be wasted. Guthorm clung to the wall and turned to the entrance, but he was stopped by Olaf's shout. By the way, I almost forgot. Guthorm turned around slowly. What else? He asked. Jarl Hakon has outlawed all Jomsvikings, Olaf said. So you're lucky. Jarls gives you a choice. Of course, you need advice in such a matter. So here, take this. Your friend may give you some useful hints, he said, throwing a leather bag with ties at Guthorm's feet. The sack fell a few feet short of Guthorm on the fresh sod. The impact loosened the rope around the neck, and the severed head rolled out of the sack. The yellow eyes lingered for a moment on Guthorm's face, and then stared into the clear blue sky, where the restless soul of Thorkel, yellow-eyed, was already telling lewd jokes to the Valkyries on the way to the feasting hall of Valhalla. Guthorm silently turned around and entered the hut. Well, Hrym, said Guthorm, sticking his head through the neck hole of his chainmail. He has grown a little fat, but mail still does not restrict his movements. We all have our own Ragnarok, don't we? The dog looked at his master silently, stretching to his full height and slowly wagging his tail from side to side. Guthorm knew what that meant. His faithful Hrym was ready to tear throats for his master or with his master to the very end. I would have talked you out of it, but you wouldn't have agreed if you even understood the words. At least his head has not grown fat, so the helmet fits no worse than it did 4 years ago. I was wondering whether it was about the cabin or not, Guthorm said, taking down his axe and the shield from hooks hammered into the wall. And now it suddenly dawned on me. There is no difference, you know. It's not about the cabin. Everyone has his own Ragnarok. Guthorm opened the door and, side by side with the dog, stepped out onto the bright winter sun.